There's this common idea about how great civilizations fall. We picture barbarians at the gate, massive armies pouring over the walls, maybe some kind of huge, unavoidable disaster.
Right. It's a simple narrative. It's clean. You have a clear enemy and a clear victim, and it makes for a good story.
But it's almost never the real story, is it? When we look at the sources, when we really scrutinize the timelines, a much scarier truth starts to emerge.
A far more terrifying one. Great states, whether we're talking about ancient republics, medieval empires, or even modern nations, they rarely die by murder from an outside force.
They die by suicide.
Institutional suicide, that's exactly it.
And that's the core of our deep dive today. We're going to try and move past the big flashy dates of the final battle and focus instead on the decades of decay that come before. We're looking at three incredibly different places in time.
Right, we've got Baghdad in 1258, the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age.
Then we have the Roman Republic, all the way back in 44 BCE.
And to show this isn't just ancient history, we're bringing it right into the modern era. Pakistan in 1999.
Our mission is to find the pattern, to extract the precise, enduring model of institutional decay that makes a powerful state so fragile it's just waiting to be pushed over.
And we're deliberately looking beyond the politics and the military tactics. This is about the rule of law. We're searching for the single, fundamental structural failure that connects all three of them. We're looking for that exact moment when a state's system, its courts, its administration, its leaders, just stops believing in itself.
So the big question is, how long does it really take for a state to die from the inside out? And why is it always the internal systems that are the real cause of death? That's what we need to unpack.
Precisely. We're treating these three collapses not as separate stories, but as three versions of the exact same constitutional failure.
Okay, so let's start with Baghdad, 1258. I mean, this is one of the most devastating collapses in history. At this point, Baghdad isn't just a city. It's the crown jewel of the Islamic Golden Age.
It's the intellectual and cultural center of the world. You have the House of Wisdom, incredible wealth, learning, innovation. From the outside, it must have seemed completely indestructible.
But the sources we're looking at make a really crucial point. The final brutal sack of the city by the Mongols, by Hulagu Khan's army, that wasn't some sudden event.
No, not at all. That's the common misconception. If you only read the military accounts, you'd think this unstoppable force just crushed a perfectly healthy state. But the truth is, Baghdad had been dying for decades. The final blow was quick, yes, but the state was already hollowed out.
Okay, so let's get into that. The decay that happened before the Mongols were even a serious threat. What were those specific internal fractures? The sources seem to start with the justice system.
And that's fundamental. The judiciary is like the immune system of a state. And in Baghdad, it had collapsed. The entire administrative system was, well, it was drowning in corruption.
What does that mean on a practical level for the average person?
It means the rules don't apply anymore. Or they only apply if you can't afford to pay your way out of them. Land claims, taxes, government jobs, everything was for sale. Judges could be bought. Officials acted with total impunity.
So the predictability of the state, the idea that there's a set of rules everyone lives by, that just evaporated.
It evaporated completely. And you can't have a functioning society like that. You just have a system of personal favors, bribes, and brute force.
And at the same time, while the system is rotting from the bottom up, what's happening at the top with the caliphs?
Total isolation. They were physically removed in their palaces, of course, but it was more than that. It was a political and emotional disconnect. They had no real idea what was happening on the ground, especially with the economy, which was suffering badly.
That kind of isolation, I imagine, leads to paralysis.
It leads directly to political paralysis.
Yeah.
The different factions, political, religious, they were in a constant state of war with each other.
So instead of arguing within the rules of the system,
They started to see the system itself as just a prize to be won. It became this vicious zero-sum infighting that made any kind of long-term planning, like, say, defending against an existential threat, completely impossible. The internal fighting was more dangerous than any external enemy.
it's a chilling thought that the paralysis inside the walls is what makes you weak to the threat outside. And this extended to the military, right? The sources talk about a collapse in discipline.
Exactly, and this is key. A weak military is usually a symptom of state failure, not the cause of it.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the central government is so corrupt and broken that it can't reliably pay its soldiers or supply them or give them coherent commands, then who are those soldiers loyal to?
Not the state.
Not the state. They're loyal to their local general, to whoever pays them, to the warlord who promises them loot. The army basically fractured into a collection of private militias. So on paper, the caliphate had this huge military. In reality, it was an army in name only.
And this wasn't just a political and military collapse, it was intellectual too.
A moral collapse. I mean, the sources point out that scholars and intellectuals were being marginalized. This is Baghdad, the home of the Golden Age. The very people who could offer critical advice, foresight, and ethical guidance were being silenced because they were seen as inconvenient critics.
You get rid of the critics, and you're left with just yes men.
Courtiers and yes men, and that just accelerates the moral decay of the leadership. So you have intellectual sterility, a suffering economy, a corrupt administration, and then the final ingredient, a total evaporation of trust between the rulers and the people.
If you don't trust your leaders to be competent or just in peacetime, why on earth would you risk your life to defend them in a war?
You wouldn't, and that's exactly what happened. When Hulagu Khan finally demanded submission, Baghdad was completely incapable of forming any unified strategy. They couldn't agree on whether to fight, to negotiate, or to look for allies. The state's capacity to act was already dead.
Which brings us to the final caliph, Al-Mustasim Billah. He seems to be the perfect embodiment of this whole institutional failure.
He really is a tragic figure. The sources list his mistakes, and they are all failures of governance, not just battlefield errors.
He was arrogant, right? He looked down on the Mongols.
Completely. A dangerous, dismissive arrogance based on Baghdad's past glory, not its present reality. He repeatedly ignored direct warnings from his own generals and advisors. They told him the army was underfunded and scattered, and he just didn't listen.
That sounds like more than just bad leadership. It's an institutional belief that you're invincible, that history or God will protect you no matter what.
It is. He saw the Mongols as a temporary problem, not an existential threat that required mobilizing the entire state. He had months to prepare, to gather resources from the provinces.
But he couldn't, because those provinces weren't loyal anymore.
Exactly. Years of neglect and injustice meant they weren't answering the call from the capital. Add to that a total failure of diplomacy. He didn't build alliances with other powers who also feared the Mongols, and Baghdad was left utterly alone.
So, to sum it up, no coherent defense, no institutional readiness, no public morale, no political unity. It was, as you said, a hollowed-out state just waiting for the final push.
An institutionally bankrupt city awaiting foreclosure.
And when the Mongols finally broke through, the destruction was absolute. The stories of the libraries being destroyed, scholars massacred, the infrastructure ruined, it's horrifying.
It is. But the constitutional lesson here, the real insight from the sources, is that the state was already dead before the siege even began. The tragedy wasn't just a military defeat, it was constitutional death.
It was institutional suicide.
And political paralysis. The system literally ate itself alive with corruption and infighting, and the Mongols just walked into the void to finish the job. The lesson we have to carry forward from this is so clear. When a state's core institutions die internally, external enemies become unstoppable.
The countdown begins the moment the judiciary gets weak and the leaders lose touch with the people. It doesn't matter who's at the gates.
Right. And we need to see if this is just a one-off tragedy. Was this something unique to the Abbasid Caliphate, or is it a universal pattern?
And for that, the sources take us about 1,300 years back in time to the Roman Republic. It's a powerful parallel because it shows the same slow internal erosion despite the huge differences in culture and time.
Rome, just like Baghdad, did not fall in a day. It was this long, slow process of internal corrosion that eventually paved the way for an imperial dictatorship, which was really an internal takeover.
So let's detail that corrosion. How does it mirror what happened in Baghdad, but, through the lens of a republic? It seems to start with the Senate.
It absolutely starts with the Senate, which was supposed to be the guardian of the republic.
Okay.
But we see widespread, endemic corruption. Senators were using their positions, especially as provincial governors, to amass huge personal fortunes. Public duty came a distant second to personal gain.
And that kind of corruption cripples accountability, right? It has to go hand in hand with manipulating the very systems designed to check that power, like elections.
Of course, if you're a powerful senator breaking the law to get rich, the last thing you want is a fair election where citizens can vote you out. So the sources detail the rise of political gangs, huge amounts of dark money in campaigns, and even outright violence at the polls.
And when people stop believing their vote matters, the whole system loses its legitimacy.
It loses all legitimacy, and that creates a vacuum. Power abhors a vacuum, and in Rome, that vacuum was filled by the generals.
This is the critical point, isn't it? The generals becoming more powerful than the state itself.
This is the uniquely Roman mechanism of collapse. It really started long before Caesar, back with the reforms of Marius. He changed the army from a citizen militia loyal to the Republic to a professional force loyal to the general who paid them and promised them land.
He broke the constitutional link between the army and the civilian government.
Fundamentally. So when men like Sulla or Pompey or Caesar eventually march their armies on Rome itself, it's not a foreign invasion. It's the final stage of civilian authority being overridden by personal military power, a process that had been building for a century.
And just like in Baghdad, the judicial system was powerless to stop it.
Completely. The courts couldn't touch the powerful generals or the corrupt senators. The law became just another weapon for political factions to use against each other, the optimates versus the populares, instead of being an impartial standard for everyone.
So when the law fails, what's left?
Violence. Political assassinations become common. Proscriptions, where you can legally murder your political opponents and take their property. Gang warfare in the streets of Rome. This is what happens when the political class gives up on the legal process entirely.
It means the Roman Constitution itself was just ceremonial, a piece of paper.
Exactly. People talked about it. They revered the wisdom of the ancestors, but nobody with real power felt bound by it when it got in their way. It was a relic, not a living document.
Which makes the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE such a fascinating moment. It's often seen as the cause of the fall, but it was really just a symptom.
It was the point of no return. The assassins, like Brutus, thought they were saving the Republic by killing a tyrant, but they were trying to perform CPR on a body that was already dead. All their act did was trigger the final bloody civil wars that officially ended the Republic.
The diagnosis is just chillingly identical to Baghdad.
It's the exact same story. Institutions weakened by corruption, politics polarized into warring factions, the rule of law becomes meaningless. And then personal power completely replaces constitutional power. The destruction was internal. The Republic committed suicide. And the strongman Caesar, then Augustus, just stepped into the void.
So the real walls of a state aren't stone. They're the rules, and the people's belief that those rules will be enforced fairly for everyone.
Once that belief is gone, the state is just an empty shell waiting for a new owner.
This pattern feels so ancient, tied to caliphates and republics. But the sources bring this right into the modern world, showing that this kind of institutional suicide is just as much a threat to today's constitutional democracies.
It is. And our third case study, Pakistan in 1999, is a powerful modern example. It's so important because the threat isn't a foreign army, it's an internal one, using the system's own weaknesses to tear it down.
So take us to October 12th, 1999. The events of that day read like a political thriller.
They really do. It all kicks off when the Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, tries to sack his army chief, General Pervez Musharraf. And he does it while Musharraf's plane is in midair, returning from a trip.
A bold move to assert civilian control over the military.
An incredibly bold move, but one the institutions were far too weak to support. And this is the key. As we saw in Rome, the true test of a state is whether the civilian government actually controls the military. And in Pakistan, that control had been fragile for a long, long time.
So the military's response was swift.
Decisive and coordinated. The other generals immediately revolted. They seized the airport, surrounded the prime minister's house, and within hours, the whole constitutional system was gone.
Just like that.
Just like that. The constitution was suspended. Parliament dissolved. And this is critical for our theme, any judges who might object were detained or forced out.
So they go straight for the judiciary.
Immediately. The new military regime knew exactly where the final line of defense was. Musharraf's government then forced something called the Provisional Constitutional Order, the PCO, on the remaining judges.
What was that?
It was a new oath. It basically forced the judges to swear allegiance not to the original constitution, but to the new reality created by the military takeover. If you refused the oath, you were fired. It was a purge designed to create a compliant judiciary.
And this leads us to the absolute critical moment where this coup goes from being just a temporary power grab to something legally validated.
Yes. The Supreme Court case, Zafar Ali Shah v. General Musharraf in 2000. This is where we see the judiciary effectively signing off on the death of the constitutional order.
How on earth could they do that? What was the legal justification?
They use something called the doctrine of state necessity.
Okay, you have to break that down for us. What is that?
It's a sort of legal escape hatch. It argues that in truly exceptional circumstances, say a massive political or economic crisis that the civilian government can't handle, that extraordinary measures are necessary to save the state, even measures that violate the Constitution.
So it's the idea that you have to break the law to save the system.
Precisely. And Pakistani courts had a history with this. In some earlier coups, they'd validated them, saying a successful revolution creates its own legality. In other cases, they pushed back hard, calling them treason. So when this coup happened, the court had precedents pointing in both directions.
And in the Zafar Ali Shah case, they chose to validate it.
They did. And the sources are clear on how devastating this was. It permitted the full suspension of the Constitution, the very document the court exists to protect. It retroactively legalized the military takeover.
And it went even further than that, didn't it?
It did. And this is the direct parallel to the Roman strongman. The court gave the military ruler, Musharraf, the power to amend the Constitution himself.
So they handed the legislative power of the entire country to one unelected general.
Yes. It transformed a temporary coup into a new, legally sanctioned order. The judiciary, instead of being the final defense against the unconstitutional act, became the institution that provided the legal cover for it.
But to be fair, weren't they operating under incredible pressure? I mean, with their colleagues being detained and Parliament gone, is it really suicide or is it just survival?
And that's the essential question. The sources acknowledge the immense coercion, but the real failure wasn't just in that one moment. It was in the years leading up to it. Just like in Baghdad and Rome, Pakistan's institutions were already incredibly weak from toxic political polarization and corruption.
The system was already sick.
The system was already sick. The civilian government was seen by many as corrupt and ineffective. So when the coup happened, a lot of ordinary people actually welcomed it, hoping for some stability. The internal health of the institutions was so poor that one illegal act was enough to bring the whole house of cards down.
It's the same pattern again. Internal weakness creates the opportunity for a strong man. The system was so broken that a military takeover, validated by a legal doctrine that puts order above law, seems like a reasonable option.
So now we have these three events: Baghdad, Rome, Pakistan, spanning more than 2,000 years. And the sources are really insisting that we see them as the same story, just in different languages.
Okay, so let's synthesize this. Let's pull out the unbreakable laws of political decay that connect all three. If we start with the institutional trajectory, the decay pattern itself.
It's remarkably similar. In Baghdad, it was a slow, steady decay from corruption. In Rome, it was also decades of corruption, but it was about using the formal institutions for personal enrichment until they were hollow.
And in Pakistan?
It was erosion by political conflict. The polarization was so intense that the government just couldn't function, which made it vulnerable. So the methods are different: bribery, political warfare, but the result is identical. The institutions lose their ability to govern justly.
Then you have the leadership failure. And this isn't about one person's character. It's about the failure of the central authority to protect the system.
Right. In Baghdad, the caliph couldn't unite the state against an external enemy. In Rome, the Senate couldn't control its own powerful generals. The law was just too weak to constrain their ambition.
And in Pakistan, the civilian government couldn't control the military. And the constitutional balance of power just shattered. In every case, the official leadership was unable to preserve the constitutional order when it was challenged.
And the consequences are just as predictable. Baghdad's collapse leads to foreign domination. Rome's leads to dictatorship. Pakistan's leads to a decade of military rule and long-term institutional damage.
Okay, let's drill down on the heart of it. The failure of the justice system, the one part of the state that's supposed to be impartial.
In Baghdad, the sources are blunt. The Constitution became meaningless because the justice system was powerless. If you had money, the law didn't apply to you. It was that simple.
In Rome, the Constitution was just ignored by powerful men, and the judiciary couldn't do a thing about it. The courts became political tools. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the Senate's legal orders were just words. They had no real power behind them.
And in Pakistan, the failure was maybe the most profound because it involved the court's own participation. The Constitution was suspended, and the judiciary, after being pressured and reshaped, effectively signed off on it. It used a legal doctrine to rationalize its own submission.
The common thread, then, is that the justice system fails to be that final firewall. It either gets corrupted, goes silent, or, in the worst case, it actively helps dismantle the system it's supposed to protect.
And that brings us to the ultimate insight from all this, the core principle, the ratio decidendi that you can derive from these three cases.
What is it?
The sources put it perfectly. They say, a nation does not fall when attacked by enemies. It falls when its institutions lose the will to uphold justice.
The will to uphold justice. It's not about power or money, it's about will.
Exactly. The Mongol army was a huge threat, but it was only fatal because Baghdad's institutions had already lost the collective will to defend themselves or function justly. Caesar could only rise because the Senate had lost the will to enforce the law on its own members.
And Musharraf's coup was validated because the court, when faced with the crisis, ultimately lacked the unified will to choose the Constitution over the perceived need for order. It's the loss of judicial integrity that marks the point of no return. #tag outro.
And the fallout from these collapses, it wasn't minor. These events changed the course of world history.
The fall of Baghdad in 1258 didn't just end the dynasty. For all intents and purposes, it ended the classical Islamic Golden Age. A global center of learning was just extinguished.
And Rome's collapse ended the idea of constitutional republicanism for centuries. It ushered in the age of emperors, of dictatorships, a model of rule that dominated the West for almost 2,000 years.
In Pakistan, the 1999 coup and its legal validation set a dangerous precedent, reshaping the balance of power for a decade and embedding this vulnerability deep into the system.
The lesson, the terrifying shared lesson from all three, is so clear. When you see the internal governance start to break down, when institutions are consistently weakened, when the judiciary is silent or corrupt, when leaders are self-serving and the people are divided, the external blow is just the finishing touch.
The enemy at the gate doesn't kill the state. It just comes to collect the body.
And this deep dive really puts a spotlight on the absolute necessity of judicial courage. You know, political fighting, corruption, bad leaders, those things are almost constants in history. But the final point of failure, so often, isn't with the politicians. It's with the judges.
When the judiciary goes silent, or worse, becomes complicit, that's the sign that the state has truly lost the will to live.
It is. That's the structural fragility we have to watch for in our own time.
So that leaves you with one final thought to consider.
Yeah.
Based on this historical pattern.
If the rule of law is the final barrier, and we know that political division and leadership failures are constants, what happens when courts in any country today start to choose what they see as stability over their oath to uphold justice? How many nations right now, facing their own internal crises, are showing the exact same early symptoms that Baghdad and Rome showed decades before they fell?
Something for all of us to think about.